because they were paid well. They worked. So it was a nirvana capitalism. Rising productivity, rising wages. A capitalism in which both sides were doing real well. Catching up and eventually overtaking the older capitalisms in England, above all. Wow. Believing you lived in a charmed country, better than anywhere else. Unbelievable opportunity for working people. You know it all because those of you that are Americans have grown up in that. And now you understand the historic roots. Try to imagine with me quickly then, what happens in the 1970s when all of this stops. And it stops in the 1970s because the labor shortage is over and it never comes back. So let's quickly see what happened. First, the computer. The computer, an important modern invention, replaces huge numbers of people. Think of a grocery store. You once needed an army of 50 inventory people to keep track of how many boxes of Rice Krispies moved off the shelf so you would know when to order more replacements. Now, as you all know, it scans by a computer as your Rice Krispie box goes across the scanner, and somebody sitting in Boise, Idaho can tell you how many boxes of Rice Krispies have to be sent to every grocery store in America, and it can tell you that on an hour-by-hour basis. Computers wiped out the need for millions of people. Number two, by the 1970s, American capitalists had an incentive, of course, to use computers. Because wages had been rising for 150 years, they were higher in America than any other capitalist had. And by the 1970s, the peculiar position of the United States after World War II, when we were the only capitalist country that was left, everything else had been destroyed by the war, that was over. The Japanese and the Germans led the recovery of our competitors. By the 1970s, they were competing. By the 1970s, Americans were getting used to learning new names for cars. Instead of Ford, Chevy, and Chrysler, they learned Toyota, Datsun, and all the rest. So Americans were worried. We're at a disadvantage because our workers get paid too much. Ha-ha! A computer. I get rid of the worker. Who needs the worker? I buy one computer, I can fire 50 high-priced workers. Second thing capitalists did, besides instituting computers, is to move production out of the United States. Big time. Where? To where workers hadn't had this experience, which is where? Everywhere else in the world. To take advantage of cheap labor. Why did they do that? That goes back to what I told you. Because the capitalist gets more surplus, the less he has to pay the workers for the work they do. So of course you move from here and reopen the factory in Shanghai. Of course, Starbucks is opening more new coffee shops in China than it is in the United States now. Of course. You know what you have to pay a coffee producer and a barista in Shanghai? More or less nothing. And it's more than nothing, they have to live, but not much more. And by American standards, fantastic. So, two other things happen. Not only are jobs disappearing, because the computer and export of jobs is happening, but suddenly more Americans, or people in America, are looking for work. First, and most important, adult, white women move into the paid labor force by the millions starting in the 1970s. Whether you call that women's liberation or you call that a changing culture or whatever you call it, there's a movement of a whole new part of our population who used to define themselves as mothers, homemakers, and wives and all of that. And they want a job now. They want a job out there in the world, just like the men do. So they're coming in huge numbers. And finally, we have yet another wave of immigration for a whole host of reasons, but not from Europe this time, mostly from Latin America. Coming in, looking for work, women looking for work at a time when the computer and export of jobs, the labor shortage is over. The supply of workers now exceeds the demand. And what does every capitalist do, whether or not he's ever gone to a business school? He realizes, I don't have to raise wages anymore, ever. I got loads of people who want a job and can't find one. If any of my workers complain that I've stopped raising wages, I say to them, have a nice day. There's 400 people out there who would take your job tomorrow. So be real quiet, and I won't slam the door on you. And you know something? Most employers don't have to tell that to workers. They already figured it out.